Welcome to Decoded, the podcast that decodes the design, technology, and experiences shaping our world and planet. I am Elisa Leñero.
And I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen. Together we explore the systems, behaviors, and technologies influencing how we live, work, and connect, from human interactions to the ecosystems we are part of.
Each episode is a conversation with technologists, designers, entrepreneurs, and everyday users. Join us. Hi, welcome back to the show. My name is Melissa.
And I'm Saima.
I'm a designer by training and currently rediscovering what design is in times where the world is challenged in many different ways, from the artificial intelligence revolution to deep societal changes and massive ecosystem destruction.
And I'm a professor of design engineering and innovation and director of DigitLab, a research lab that's exploring design and digital technologies based in the University of Exeter. Together, we're diving into a question in this episode that's really been in the back of our minds for a while. And that is, what actually counts as a product? We talk a lot about designing products, and I've even been the head of design products at the Royal College of Art. And perhaps the biggest question we have is, how does design create values beyond the traditional idea of designing an object or a product? So we've both been educated as industrial designers or product designers. And then the thing was to create a product which you could hold. And we came up with many ideas in that journey. We would sometimes be a product, something that's made of plastic, sometimes materials of metals, and it would have electronics or digital interfaces. And during that journey, that sort of iterative designing something, developing it, prototyping it, we would make lots of prototypes. Blue foam was our friend at that time, and then maybe it shows my date and my age. And sandpaper and working with a hot wire, that's what we used to do to generate really quick prototypes that enabled us to test. But since then, things have changed, Melissa, haven't they? How do you see things?
Yeah, I think this is a very good episode to discuss, as you said, like not only from how the product has evolved, but also from the perspective of when we explain to people that we are designers. Sometimes they always think of, oh, it's a product, right? Like it's one product that is tangible. But yeah, today a product might be an app, might be a subscription, might be behavioral change even, or a system or a story, like a story to tell um, how to go from point A to point B, how to change behavior from a person or a system that is conveyed through a story. So it's right now, I think we have different outputs, and all of that can be also combined to create an output of design. And when we were taught as industrial designers, it was also very much about different types of tangible kind of things that you can grasp, that you can play, as you were saying, Saima, with the blue foam that also was our friend. And I remember also with my friends that sometimes the quality of the product was not exactly great. And one hack that we used was using powder, like baby powder, and then you just like cover it with paint, so then it gives you some texture. So that it was like a better way of showing the end result, but it was tangible at the end of the day. And I think we are more comfortable now as not only including physical products as a chair that a lot of has been kind of like the ultimate outcome of design back in, I would say, the 70s. But right now, yeah, it's more untangible, and it has become more difficult also to explain. And I can give one example in my current job. We work with communities to develop different systems, and one of the systems that we could develop alongside with business models. So if we're talking with different communities to increase their livelihoods through economic empowerment, one way is designing business models with them. So that is very different to creating one product as before that we were doing in design. And I want to ask you, Saima, how also products have changed in your opinion as a in your experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we should come back to your examples there in the communities in a bit. But let's thinking about the physical products. That's really interesting because just the physical products have changed as well. And in the
Mhm.
time that so the last 20 years or so, there's been a rise in digital technologies. There's been Industry 4.0. I think now we're talking about Industry 5.0 even. And things have changed. So there's Professor Sir Mike Gregory, who used to be the head of the Institute for Manufacturing in the University of Cambridge. And I remember something that stuck with me for a long time that in in the past, when you manufactured a product, when you dropped it on your foot, it would hurt. But nowadays, if you dropped the product on your foot, some parts of it would not hurt. It's no longer tangible. And those bits are often to do with data or parts that are digital, which can be upgraded and adapted to people's requirements to be customized and be changed while you still have some parts that are physical. So that means the art of creating these products have been really transformed. So this is not just changing the processes, the product development processes, but the pace at which you develop something that's physical that requires developing tools that then manufacture the products, and those have lead times. Whereas something like software design, generally it's a person. I mean, maybe right now it can also be AI in there that is upgrading and coding. And so you don't have these long lead times. So working with those two bits together requires new challenges and new types of thinking for people who are even designing physical products. But I think beyond those products, there's other things that I think you've hinted to. So we've got systems that can be designed, we've got behaviors to be designed, and we've got experiences. And just thinking through some of those examples, I'm curious about the one that you've talked about in the communities. How could you sort of unfold a little bit of how that took place and where did design, because in designing business models, I currently sit in a business school. I'm not sure business model people will immediately see where design comes in. And this is really important because it's sort of hidden away. Yet it is important, particularly when you're innovating and you're doing something completely differently. We need to come up with an approach to generate that business model. So maybe you could expand a little bit on your idea on those communities.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. That has been a challenge that I have when I explain what I do, because I am putting design. So I am putting the word design in international development.
Mm,
And that usually is not paired, right? Like going back to the last episode when we talk about designers being have the capacity and the capability to talk to different disciplines and to include different disciplines. This is another example in which a group of designers we um, we 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 work with the communities. So I want to show you kind of like the process so then you can visualize it. But the way that it starts is we have, instead of parachuting people into the communities and telling them this is what you're going to be doing now to increase your livelihoods and your economic empowerment, what we do is we ask the people, what do you want to work on? What do you want to focus
mm,
on? What will we, for example, if we're talking with a farmer, we'll be asking the farmer, what are you interested in growing? What would
yeah,
be the best way for you to spend your time and your effort growing? So then we start with desirability, right? What is desirable for the user, or
yeah,
in this case the farmer, to be growing? um, and eventually we're going to work with people that are more in business model creation, for example, and like for potentially also touching on finances, economics, marketing. But as designers, we start with desirability. What is the actual user needs and wants? And then from there, we start talking to different stakeholders, which means that with government, local government, with the different the other farmers that are around, how they can
yep,
support each other, or even like microfinance institutions that they're going to be supporting the farmers to access loans or credits, for example, or even the people that are going to be buying the yield from the farmers. So it's not only starting with desirability, but then moving to feasibility and viability. So there are like three lenses that we look at. in order to create a sound business model with the community that we're working with. So I think in that case, as you said, when I explain to people I'm a designer, but I'm modeling business models, people tend to think, but you are not in business, right? Like you are a
Yeah.
designer. So you should be designing, for example, something like a product that is, I don't know, something very specific in agriculture. And actually we have that capacity. But in this case, it's an intangible output that we are creating, which is understanding what the user needs and then also providing a like a fertile ecosystem for that farmer to succeed when they're selling their products and their yield. So that's kind of like a way in which design has been embedded in international development to create more desired products, viable solutions, and
Yeah.
to be feasible in the context in which we are operating.
No, that's great. And it's really powerful because it's showing this co-creation approach of really bringing stakeholder analysis, understanding the needs, but using that to create a business model that's rooted in that place and those communities and those people, which is actually at the very front end. And if you didn't do it that way, you'd have a business model that perhaps isn't fit for those people and it's less likely to work. And that is really interesting to see. I've seen other examples in systems. So the tax system, that can be quite sort of hard to penetrate. And often these very big services are designed thinking of people in terms of numbers. So civil
Mhm.
servants here would like numbers quite often. But from my experience back in Denmark when I was there, the role of understanding users and the power of the stories that you mentioned were really powerful in developing those systems or highlighting when there were issues. And I remember one story that particularly was important with one of our alumni from the design innovation program in Denmark who went to work for the tax system. And the tax system works by calculating and taking you through a system. And at the time, Denmark had a system where for the first few years, you would have a certain fixed rate of tax if you came in as in certain categories, and then it would change. And people often didn't realize that and would end up with problems with having to back pay tax. And these people would just be seen as a number. And then there was a
Mm.
powerful video made of one of these women who was one of these numbers to show really the impact on her life of getting that system wrong. And when you've got it wrong, she was at the point of leaving the country and having to rethink her finances and the impact on it. And of course, they actually made an arrangement so that didn't need to happen, any of those things. But that design process of thinking of the needs of the users and explaining the user in these systems where numbers matter because the efficiency of how many people go through it matters. But understanding also alongside those numbers what it means for one person was quite powerful in rethinking those systems. So that's a really interesting one. But we've also seen recently in design that there's a couple of different directions taking place. And as I started with talking about how we change physical products with digital parts in them, we can see two directions taking place. So one, there's a bigger responsibility on designers. And as part of that, thinking from circular economy, which we should probably have an episode or a couple of episodes on in the future. And we've got an episode lined up on green skills for
Mhm.
designers from the Design Council in the next period. So that will link neatly to that. But circular economy is this idea of reusing your products. I mean, I'm simplifying it for as long as possible, thinking about the waste of products in those systems and how they could be reused elsewhere, thinking about extending the life of the product. And it ultimately it could also lead to things like shared products, shared product service systems, and rethinking how you use things. Um, so that's one direction, and that pushes that with that responsibility, it pushes you away from the idea that a designer should just produce a product at the end of whatever their creative process is, because you could think wider and you could think about that big societal impact. And the second direction is the other one that we touched on is the digital economy, and as part of that, you can see one of the companies I work with that they developing these systems lights, intelligent systems, where you've got data. And at a certain point, the data becomes more valuable than the physical product of the lights. And thinking through those business things. Unfortunately, she's also said yes to come on the episode, so we can get her to talk about that. So those things are showing how products are becoming the physical form of a product is becoming perhaps less important. At the same time, we've seen another direction, which is, I think, quite interesting. So we've seen how we've got AI and ChatGPT and these interfaces, and little work has been done on the physical interface. And I know that's a project that Johnny Ive is kind of currently looking at. So some of these very digital products also need the interface. So it's interesting that it's both ways around, isn't it? It's the physical products that are changing, and the role of design being bigger than that into systems in there. Yeah, that's quite interesting. Do you think there's other sort of outputs? Like you've gently sort of mentioned behavior change in the beginning. Have you seen examples of where you can use design to promote behavior change?
Yeah, I think for some of the examples that I have is in public health.
Yeah.
And again, designers can also work in public health in terms of the behavior change campaigns to encourage people to, first of all, raise awareness of how important it is to have public health or to have health in your life. For example, when you have to wash your hands, not only for COVID, when the pandemic happened, but in general, going to when you go to the toilet, when you are preparing food, etc., etc., and probably we in particular countries like in the UK, for example, we have
Mm.
that already embedded in some of our systems. So probably that's not a very, let's say, sexy topic, but actually in many, many countries, that is not the norm.
Yeah.
And in order to change and to increase the safety of the people, to increase their health, we have to start with raising awareness. And one way of doing it is through the stories that we tell, that we use design to tell those stories. And how do we tell a story? We start by understanding what people actually value in those communities. So for example, right now for me or in the UK, we could value probably that is also something that is embedded in our countries. Probably we follow the rules. Probably it's something that has been passed through generations, and it's something that your family teaches you. But when you don't have that structure, then we tap into other behaviors. Like for example, you want to have your neighbors recognition, and that's part of pride that you have in your community. So we tap into the emotional side as well, to change part of their behavior, to increase the health of children, of people, and to reduce, I don't know, child mortality, for example. So it's,
Hmm.
as we said in the past episode, that is weak. It's a wicked problem because it's connected to many things, but it's not the output of it. It's not a product or something tangible. It's actually reducing numbers of child mortality, for example, or is increasing the number of people that wash their hands correctly after going to the toilet, or is increasing health by people not getting sick and paying the bills of a hospital that is quite expensive by washing their hands when they are cooking a meal. So it's kind of like a set of different systems that we go through in order to understand what is the ultimate goal that we want to aim for. And then we use different outputs within one set of a project.
Yep.
And what I mean by set of outputs could be behavior change campaign, understanding the emotional design that we should be aiming or targeting, even a communication plan on showing the steps that you have to go through when you are washing your hands. So it's, yeah, that could be another type of example. And I really like the examples that you gave on the tax systems, which sometimes you tend to think that it's something not very sexy, but actually it's so important to understand that we can provide, uh, yeah, different steps and provide the human side of the taxes and of the
Yep.
numbers. So then policymakers can also make better decisions when they are talking to people and not to numbers.
That's right. And the behavior change one is quite fascinating. I've been looking a little bit at data driven design for part of my work. And as part of that, we've seen that one way of using data is to drive, well, one is to understand behaviors, and the other is to use those behaviors to discover about the needs of users. And the second is actually to use that to adapt products that you may have to the people. So the interventions or the design or the service really applies. And as that, I've been sort of looking at behavioral design for behavior change. A lot of it sits with psychologists. And you see an increase with some projects where you're using AI as well into them. And I think the role of the designer can often be missed, but you've got these opportunities because you've got products which can be adapted. Because, like we talked about before, is a physical nature of a product. Also, there's parts that are digital. That digital bit can change depending on your habits. So if it learns about you, it can adapt to be the best for you. And we've seen examples I think, in apps. So it's not particularly coming, again, from health. Many of these examples are coming from health or sustainability. Those tend to be where I've seen those examples. But we've seen examples with using nudges, so sort of prompting you to do something. And it's very funny because I always wondered where that word came from. And I have a little pet dog. And when I have forgotten to give her kibble, she'll come and literally put her nose and nudge me. And that is exactly what it's doing. It's a prompt to remind me to change my behavior and go and feed my dog. But in here, we've seen examples with, for example, using walking sticks with sensors in it, detecting when elderly people or people with lower mobility aren't walking enough, and then using that to prompt the user to actually go around and walk a little bit more. Or in rehabilitation after a stroke, there's examples used checking in on how many exercises you've been doing or if you've been taking the medication, and then reminding you to do that. So behavioral change, I guess we see it in many different places, but in policy, in products, in all sorts of places, in the examples you've just said, the role of the designer is less clear. I think it's very becoming clearer when you're using it in products that could be adapted. But it's also important in policy. And I do recall during the pandemic in the UK, anyway, there were certain groups that didn't want to have vaccines. And the communication in trying to prompt the change, I would say, largely failed. And it was often messages being provided by very senior people who perhaps these groups of people didn't have any resonation with, and a design approach to really understand the needs of people and their behaviors and what motivates them would be really quite useful. So it's that sort of stakeholder analysis of what we call stakeholder analysis, understanding all the different groups of people and understanding what their needs are, but understanding their motivation and then supporting it. And you can see other apps examples. Duolingo is one I use and actually love using it. But I hate their design for behavior change. And I'm sorry if anybody's listening out there. But the moment you stop using it, the app's face turns to a miserable face. And then it will tell you how many days it tries to aim by blaming and punishing. And that for me doesn't motivate me in the slightest. So that's just a little example of how the intervention really needs to match the user and the user groups in there. But those are some examples that we've talked about. I guess the other examples would be the design of experiences. And what are your thoughts on those bits? Or have you seen examples that you particularly think are great examples?
Yeah, I think I want to touch on the Duolingo because you were touching on emotional design, right?
Yeah,
Like the emotions, like how also design can be triggers certain emotions, and that could go to that could be linked to experience design. And I think for me, I want to touch on the emotional design, which is something that has been the language
yeah,
has been around for a while, but it has shifted from the 70s or even the 60s that we were talking about emotional design, or even the 80s, to now the emotional design that has changed so massively. As you were saying, like before, probably it was an emotional design that an object kind of elicit in you, which is another episode that we have in our books. that it talks about anthropomorphism, which is how like the human side that we give to products, right?
Yeah,
That it's
that's right.
and
Yeah.
but again, like if we give that emotion to an object, that was more talked about like on the 80s, probably 70s. But now, as you said, it's more on the technology side that we're also giving more like we're morphing an
Mm,
object or a technology into something that becomes more human, which is the owl from Duolingo
yep.
being sad and making us feel terrible because we're not practicing. And it's just like how much of that, I think for me, it's like a tension of how much of that we should be allowing it to happen versus how much do we have to put constraints to it? Because at the end of the day, it's another time seeker and time grabber of
Yep.
attention. Um, yeah. So I think for me, yeah, that could be, again, that could be another episode that we discuss
That I
in the
think so.
future.
And I have next to me always books, so this is the one. I'll just plug it.
Yeah,
Emotional design.
exactly.
So this is the one
Yeah.
that's most commonly used. It's from Donna Norman, and I think most people would probably in the design world would be familiar with that, and that's where largely some of the theories on emotional design have come from. And as you say, they've changed, and I think we're mixing a little bit because we're talking about behavior change. There's some element of emotional design in there, but it's really understanding the interventions and what's going to motivate people to behave. Emotional design typically looks at three different perspectives, which one is your first response to the object or the thing. And the second is your interaction or experience. So when we're talking about designing of experience, that's the other one. And the third is the way it makes you feel. And designer goods and branding are often in that third one. But these theories, I think we should have an in-depth episode on that at one point. But these emotional design and understanding how to use experience can be used for things other than products. So we've seen examples where we've looked at food and scarcity of food and some of the projects, student projects that we worked with. And I had done a class on emotional design. This on based on a little bit on Donald Norman's work and a little bit of some other work on how you understand people and how you sort of try and design for those groups of people. And the student in question looked at food and the idea of using insect food. So that pops up from time to time, that if there's scarcity of food, how can we use and eat insect food? And I've actually tried insect ice cream. I think it was in order to get free subscription or a cheaper subscription to The Economist when I was in London somewhere. It was really crunchy. That's all I can say with the ice cream in there. And it was not a particularly beautiful experience. But what the student did, which was fascinating, she applied this emotional design theory. So if we are going to use insects, a scarce form for food, how can we improve that experience? And she made this beautiful pyramid with the insects food. So it looks like a luxurious chocolate with this golden powder food dust. So suddenly you've moved it from this ice cream that I tasted with black bits that were all crunchy to a beautiful object and one of the most luxurious looking ice cream. So of course you've got the whole experience, not ice cream, sorry, chocolate or whatever it looked like a little triangular pyramid. So these theories that we've traditionally used on products can be used in all sorts of other ways that we perhaps, don't even recognize. For me, it was a surprise actually, because I hadn't thought that you could apply emotional design to food. But of course, it's really relevant, and that could be really,
It
really, really
is.
useful and interesting.
But I
Mhm.
think that that is a great insight for me because we're talking about the food system. We're
Yeah,
talking about um, the food with insects and, well, insect food and how it touches on emotional design. But I think that's why, again, I want to stretch. That's why it's so important to include designers in the conversation, because probably a person from advertising would have come up with the idea of creating a pyramid that it's luxurious, etc., etc. But if you include designers, then you will understand how important the context is. And what I mean by that is, if you would bring this to Mexico, in
yeah,
Mexico, I'm from Mexico, so if you would bring this to Mexico, we would be probably surprised because it's another way of saying insects, but we've been eating insects for a long time,
Yes.
right? Like we take mezcal, which is one type of beverage with a alcoholic beverage, with worm. And
Yeah.
this is something, of course, when I was little and when I saw some people drinking mezcal with a worm, I didn't say, oh, that looks delicious. But for me, it was already in my conception of the world. So if someone would say, I'm going to bring chocolates with insects, okay, it's another way of saying insects. It's another way of saying worms and eating crickets, for example. But if you take that to a different context, so where people haven't seen that before and it's not in their ecosystem or
Mhm.
part of their worldview, then it will be very different. And it's not only, and what I want to stretch is not only the advertising part of selling a chocolate, is actually understanding the behavior, the desirability, understanding the needs of the user, and what will be kind of the emotion that you're tapping into
Yeah.
the user when that person is going to be probably deciding to buy that chocolate. So
Yeah.
I think that was a great example of emotional design, insect foods, and how important the context matters.
Yes, absolutely. The context, yes, of course, it's very different. So I guess that context would probably be a nice fancy restaurant where you'd be faced with this suddenly, or even in a shop, and then suddenly you would be buying it. Um, so yeah, context really matters, which probably wasn't explained very well there, but that is really important. So we've talked about a few different examples here. We've talked about systems and tax systems, and you've talked about your business models in there and the how you can bring the stakeholder thinking into those business models. And I've talked a little bit about how designer responsibility has shifted to the circular economy type thinking, where we're trying to keep products there for longer or think about shared products or product service systems in there. And also the driver of the digital economy, where we've got
Mhm.
options to personalize and adapt, bring in very neatly what you've talked about behavior change. Beyond those, do you see other examples of where we could designers, or you've seen evidence of design and that creative type of thinking being valuable, and what sort of outputs are coming out?
Yeah, I think you mentioned experience outputs or experience design, which I think we haven't touched on, and you mentioned it before. And the service and experience outputs is another way in which design has some kind of magic.
Yeah.
And I would say, and that one would be, for example, customer journeys. The
Mm,
customer
yeah.
journeys are very important to understand how you are taking one person from point A to point B. And I'm not meaning about mobility. That's not what I mean. What I mean is more if you want to, and I'm just going to put the easiest example. Um, if you want to, if you're queuing, for example, in the grocery store or even the grocery store, it has a layout. It has a very important layout where they are putting, depending on the aisle, they're putting some products at the top, middle, bottom, and it depends which type of products you are putting in the middle because the
Yeah.
middle are going to be prime products because you're seeing them at eye level. The ones at the top probably are the ones that you are not buying most or depending on the brands, et cetera, et cetera. So like understanding what is the, how you want to guide the user through an experience
Mm,
on a certain and a
yeah.
specific task, which in this case, if we're talking about the groceries, is you want the user to go in, buy, select the products, but like pay and then leave. But there's a lot of different behaviors that you are tapping into. So in that case, as designers, we understand what would be the different customer journeys that we have to inherently address when a user is going to the groceries. And another example could be the use of like the tills that now you are not interacting with the user and then you directly
Yeah.
self pay or like you pay in the self checkouts. Another example could be what Amazon did with the fresh stores, which actually just go in and buy face recognition and other technology, then just grab the product and then you leave. You actually don't even pay the
Yeah.
actual action of paying. You pay because it's connected through your account, but you don't actually go through the process of paying. And that is another way of understanding what was valuable for the user. If they were success or not, that's a different story. But for now, it's more about what is the journey that we understand as designers that we put the user through.
No,
That
that's
could be another
interesting, and that's
example.
great because I've always thought of customer journeys more at the front end as the tool to understand the pain points, which is often, so understanding how the current flow goes, and then thinking this is the point of redesigning. But yes, of course, that customer journey and that experience going through as you start doing new business ideas like the ones you've just mentioned, that's really valuable in there. And I think those experiences, um, beyond those experiences, you've also got opportunities to personalize people's experiences through things like Internet of Things. So what we talked about a little bit before, that adaptation in there. And emotional design is also important in them. So it's not the only thing that's important, but how that one bit of that interaction, so whether it's a physical product or a system or a service like the one you've just described that you're walking through, they're all really important. So we've talked about quite a few different ideas now that we've touched on. And I just think probably beyond that, I guess there's this challenge of understanding the role of designers, but how do designers find roles for themselves? So in service design, it's quite clear, and in tax systems, I know that they did hire a design team, and I know in the government in the UK that there's a policy team where they are looking at design ideas in there. But how would you identify a space for yourself in these different roles? It's quite difficult. I don't know what your experience is from looking and seeing the world around us. What would you think that would, like, how would we
I
give
thought,
advice?
yeah, that's a great question, actually, because it's so difficult to find different positions and how you can embed design into the system. Because as we started in the episode, we said that sometimes designer, like, people tend to think or to box design into, oh, you're the designer, so then you are just making things more beautiful
Hmm.
and like chairs, and that's not actually what we do.
Yep.
And I think for me, another way in which I have been finding my way using my design skills in strategic outputs. And the
Mm.
strategic outputs, what I mean by that is at operating at a system or at an organizational level. And
Yep.
what I mean by that is, um, for example, creating vision statements or creating value propositions for an organization. So where I am at the moment, it has been really fruitful to see how the organization values design. And then they are including designers into their vision statements and into not the statements, but in the vision process. Or, for example, we were creating a, a moonshot, which is kind of like this very difficult, big, hairy idea
Yep.
that you
Yep.
have to pursue that is like 10 years from now, right? So, how do you set a vision for an entire organization to move forward that vision that is going to be 10 years from now, right? It's
That's right.
quite scary. But I think what they did is they included designers to go and ask different people inside the organization and outside the organization to then come up with many, many different viewpoints. And then from there, present different ideas to the organization. And we are not the only ones making decisions. We were also the enablers of that conversation. And of course, it was not only designers. We had many people involved, but they included design into that. So it's another way showing how the tools that we have as designers can be used at an organizational level to actually include different voices and to make something that is participatory, that is inclusive, that is co-created, and it's not decided top down from the strategic level the way all the way down.
Yeah.
And I think,
That's
yeah, what about
fascinating.
your experience?
No, I'm just reflecting on what you're saying actually, and I think there's um with that moonshot idea, just thinking through d- other projects that we've worked on and where we're sort of, I haven't been at the other end of being not embedded in the organizations, but working with them. Um, and we've done projects where we did future thinking 10 years, sometimes 20 years ahead, where we're trying to create an understanding of where a whole area will go. For example, there was one on the future of scent that we did, looking at what would that look like in 10, 20 years. And it is sort of speculative, that you're sort of thinking about a future. So that's one way, but that would inform the future directions. And that would, I guess, go back to the organization and can be embedded into thinking about those moonshot ideas of which direction it should be going in. In terms of generating those visions, so coming back from an education perspective, when we had designers and we were trying to support these designers in being very visionary and having their own moonshot idea, not an organizational one, we would typically do this in two ways. And one was to think about what technologies we have today and what is upcoming and emerging. What are the new possibilities? And we typically have someone scope and say, these are possible technologies that we're forecasting these technologies in the future. So they're not ready. So if we were around there today, we'd be thinking about quantum, perhaps. We'd be thinking quantum materials, quantum computing. There's some other different directions, engineering, biology, lots of different things that are emerging. And these are new areas. And then the other way we would look at it is also think about the grand challenges and the problems that we have that we want to face. Because often people think of design as problem solving. So what is those problems? And I think it's also about innovation and technology innovation and thinking about application, not just bring the two. So we would often use those two ways to generate and kick off the thinking. And it's quite interesting because the way that you've described is a third way. It's coming from bringing in different perspectives and then taking that through. And I think that's really interesting. So all of those things would be informative to strategic directions actually within companies and create that value that's probably taking a little bit of a bet, but doing it but in an informed way to move forward. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I think we've covered a lot in this topic of different types of thinking, and I think we can expand on a few in the future. So we've already said we'll talk about emotional design. We'll pick up on that digital economy and change products changing to data, and we'll bring in someone from a company, C-Sense, in to speak on that. And she's already agreed to do that, so that's perfect. And we've got Design Council that we're talking about the green skills. So the skills that designers need in thinking about not just circular economy, but planetary health and design for the planetary. So probably we should call it a day for today and say a good thank you. So thank you for me.
Yeah, thank you for me too. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Saima. And yeah, see you at the next one.
See you at the next one. And it's a pleasure to talk to you too. So thank you. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think, or if you have an idea for a future guest or topic at www.decodedpodcast.com.
Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you listen. And follow us on TikTok and Instagram at decoded.podcast. See you!